The rain fell like shattered glass over San Francisco. It was not the kind of gentle drizzle that tourists romanticized, nor the refreshing mist that poets once compared to silk. This was a relentless downpour, sheets of cold, hammering water that blurred the neon lights and turned the steep streets into dark, rushing rivers. It was the kind of storm that stripped the city bare, washing away its pretenses, leaving only raw truths behind. William Carter tightened his grip on the steering wheel of his black Bentley as he turned onto Market Street. The wipers slashed furiously. Yet still the windshield shimmered with blurred halos of red and green traffic lights. He should have been back in his penthouse by now, alone, as always, with the silence of glass walls and empty whiskey bottles. But the meeting had dragged past midnight. Another negotiation. Another billion-dollar merger. Another victory carved from the bones of men too slow to keep up with his instinct. Once those victories had meant something. Now they were ash in his mouth. The car's interior smelled faintly of leather and cologne. It was warm, insulated, safe. But William felt none of it. At 47, he had everything that men envied: power, wealth, reputation carved into the very steel of Wall Street. Yet inside there was only vacancy. Since the night his wife, Margaret, had closed her eyes for the last time in the sterile glow of a hospital room, his world had been reduced to numbers and shadows. The city outside was alive, but for him, life had long gone dim. And then he saw her. At first it was just a flicker in the corner of his vision, a blur of pink darting between the storm. He might have dismissed it as a trick of the rain, a drunk staggering across the avenue. But then the blur resolved into something small, impossibly small for this merciless hour. A child. A girl, no more than 6 years old. White skin, drenched pale beneath a tattered pink jacket that clung to her like wet paper. Her blonde hair was plastered to her cheeks, her shoes, if they could be called shoes, slapping helplessly against the pavement. She was running as if her very life depended on it, and in the next breath, William saw why. Behind her came 3 men, massive, hulking, their movements coordinated, like wolves circling prey. One had a shaved head that gleamed under the streetlight. Another carried a chain coiled in his hand. The third was barking words William could not hear above the roar of the rain, but their intent was clear. Carved into the feral twist of their faces. They weren't chasing. They were hunting. Something inside William cracked. He slammed the brakes so hard the Bentley jolted, seatbelt cutting into his chest. Tires screamed against wet asphalt, a raw sound swallowed by thunder. For a moment he froze, staring through the rain-streaked glass as though he could not believe what stood before him. He, William Carter, the man who had spent years negotiating mergers that swallowed entire corporations, was now staring at a 6-year-old child running from death. Without thinking, he threw the door open. "Get in the car!" His voice tore through the storm, a command that was less invitation than desperate demand. The girl's head snapped toward him. Their eyes met, a flash of sapphire locked into steel gray. For a fraction of a second, the world stopped. In those eyes, William saw terror. Yes, but also something else. Something fragile, trembling on the edge of breaking. Trust, or the desperate hope of it. She pivoted, her small feet splashing through a puddle, and sprinted toward him. The men shouted, louder now, realizing their prey was about to slip away. One lunged, the chain rattling as it whipped through the air. William did not think, did not calculate. He moved. He stepped into the rain with a speed his boardroom rivals would never have believed. His fist, still iron from years of boxing in youth, collided with a jaw. Pain shot up his knuckles, sharp and real, the first honest sensation he had felt in years. The second man barreled into him, knocking his shoulder against the car frame. William grunted, blood from a cut at his temple mixing with the rain. He shoved back, but the man's weight was crushing. For a split second, He thought this was how it would end, not with a grand deal or a hospital bed, but on a soaked street, swallowed by thunder. Then a voice, small, piercing, urgent. "Mister! Please!" It was the girl. She was already inside the Bentley, tiny hands clutching the seatbelt, eyes wide and pleading. And in that voice, William felt something awaken. A duty. A reason. With a surge of raw instinct, he shoved the man away, slammed the car door, and dove into the driver's seat. The third thug slammed his fist against the window as the engine roared to life. William floored the accelerator. The Bentley surged forward, tires hissing against rain-slick asphalt, throwing water in violent sprays. The men's curses faded behind them, swallowed by the storm. For several blocks, William drove like a man possessed. Red lights meant nothing, the rules of the city irrelevant. His only focus was distance between that girl and the shadows that had nearly devoured her. His breath came ragged, his hands tight on the wheel. Beside him, the child sat trembling, soaked through, clutching something small and wooden against her chest. Only when the city's skyline opened before them, lights smeared by the curtain of rain, did William allow himself to breathe. His pulse thundered in his ears. The cut on his temple dripped warm blood, trickling down his cheek. He had not felt pain in so long. And yet, in that strange and brutal moment, he realized something that chilled him more than the storm outside. For the first time in years, he felt alive. He turned to the girl. She was staring at him, her lips pressed tight, her eyes, those vast, ocean-blue eyes, still brimming with tears. Her arms wrapped protectively around the small box she held, as though it contained her entire world. The rain dripped from her hair onto the leather seat, darkening it in little pools. She looked fragile, breakable, like a porcelain doll left in a hurricane. But there was also fire in her gaze, faint but stubborn, a spark of someone who had survived more than a child ever should. William swallowed, his voice unsteady for the first time in decades. "You're safe now," he said, though he was not sure if the words were true. The girl did not answer. She simply held the box tighter, her chin trembling, and whispered one sentence that would haunt William Carter long after this night. "They took her." Her voice cracked on the last word, barely audible over the storm. But it was enough. Enough to unravel the silence that had wrapped William's life for so long. Enough to turn a man who thought he had nothing left to lose into someone who, for the first time since Margaret's death, realized he still had something worth fighting for. Outside, the rain kept falling, relentless, merciless, cleansing. Inside the car, two strangers, one broken by grief, one scarred by terror, sat together, bound by a single truth neither of them yet understood. This night was not an accident. This night was fate. The Bentley slipped through the city's arteries, rain still drumming the roof in slower rhythms, like a metronome that refused to quit. William Carter's hands clamped the wheel, yet his eyes kept sliding sideways to the child huddled in his passenger seat. She was so small. Emily. 6 years old, she had said. A name and an age, nothing more, yet already they weighed heavier than the billions he had moved across balance sheets. Her wet hair clung to her temples, her lips quivered blue, and in her lap sat that battered wooden box, guarded as if it contained her heartbeat. William adjusted the heater. The vents exhaled warmth across her, fogging the glass. She didn't speak. Neither did he. Silence lived in the car like an uninvited passenger. Memory crept in, unwelcome. Margaret, his wife, had once sat where Emily now sat. He remembered her laughter bouncing off these very leather seats, her hand reaching to change the radio, her eyes bright as the Golden Gate Bridge's lights winked in the distance. That was before the hospital bed, before the beeping monitors, before the phrase, "We've done everything we can." Since then, William had buried himself beneath skyscrapers, mergers, numbers. He was called the King of Wall Street, but kings are only men who forget how to be human. Tonight, in the storm, he had remembered. His blood still trickled from the cut on his temple, but the sting only confirmed he was alive. Strangely, he welcomed it. At a stoplight, William risked a glance. "What's in the box?" he asked, voice low, as though speaking too loudly might break her. Emily hesitated, then cracked open the lid. Inside, a photograph and a necklace. The photograph showed a woman with dark hair holding a younger Emily at a county fair. The necklace, silver, with a raindrop pendant, glinted faintly. "My mom," Emily whispered. Her tiny fingers stroked the photo's edge. They took her. William felt his chest constrict. He wanted to promise, to say, "I'll bring her back," but promises were dangerous currency. Instead, he closed the box gently, sliding it back toward her with the care one would give a holy book. As they neared Pier 14, the precinct glowed behind rain-streaked glass. A voice in William's head said, "This is the right thing. Hand her over. Let the system take it from here." He slowed, blinkers clicking like a metronome of duty. But Emily's hands clenched the box tighter. Her body trembled, not from cold, but from dread. "Please," she whispered, "don't let them send me back." William's jaw tightened. He had spent his life obeying systems, twisting them, exploiting them, but tonight, the system felt like a machine with teeth too sharp for a 6-year-old girl. He flicked the turn signal off and drove past. On the Bay Bridge, the storm thinned. The city unfurled behind them in fractured reflections. William felt something shift inside him. For years, he had lived as a man-shaped shadow, boardrooms, private jets, empty penthouses. He had forgotten his own pulse. Now a child's trembling voice had reminded him, "Protect." That single word had ripped through the fog of grief and greed. For the first time since Margaret's death, he felt not numbness, but urgency. He pressed the steering wheel button. "Call Jack Donovan." Jack was an old friend, a private investigator with more scars than patience. The line clicked after 2 rings. "Will? It's after 1. You okay?" William's eyes flicked to Emily, her lashes drooping with exhaustion, her face pale under his oversized coat. "I need you," he said simply. "There's a girl, and there are men. Oakland, I think. Meet me at my place." A pause. Then Jack's voice, firm as ever. 10 minutes. William turned into the underground garage of his glass tower. Security lights gleamed on the Bentley's hood. He cut the engine. Silence settled, punctuated only by Emily's shallow breaths. For a moment he sat motionless, his palm resting on the steering wheel, the gold band on his ring finger cold against his skin. He whispered, not to her, not to himself, but to fate. "Just one night. Then we'll make a plan." Emily stirred. Her head tilted toward him, eyes half closed, and for the first time since she'd entered his car, she looked less like prey and more like a child on the edge of sleep. William reached to steady the box on her lap before it slipped. The raindrop pendant inside clinked softly, as though echoing his vow. The man who had forgotten himself was beginning, slowly, painfully, to remember. The penthouse was silent when William carried the girl inside. At 47 floors above the city, his home was a monument of glass and steel, its walls lined with expensive art that had never been touched, its floors polished to a sterile sheen. From the floor-to-ceiling windows, San Francisco shimmered in the distance, still wet from the storm. But here inside, the silence was almost oppressive. It was the silence of a man who lived without voices, without laughter, without interruptions. Emily clutched her wooden box so tightly her knuckles went white. She looked around with wide blue eyes, not in awe but in disbelief, as though she had stepped into a strange museum. The marble counters, the chandeliers, the leather couches arranged like sculptures, none of it seemed real to her. She stood there dripping rainwater onto a rug that had cost more than a family car, her pink jacket heavy with water, her hair clinging to her cheeks. And William realized with a pang that everything he owned, all of it combined, could not warm this single trembling child. Martha, his housekeeper, appeared from the hallway. She was in her late 60s, small but brisk, with silver hair pulled into a bun and eyes that had watched William grow harder through the years. She froze when she saw the girl, then looked at William. He simply said, "She'll stay tonight." Martha, to her credit, asked no questions. She nodded, disappeared into a closet, and returned with towels and a blanket. Emily allowed herself to be wrapped, but her small body remained stiff, her arms never letting go of the box. Her eyes darted toward the door, toward the windows, anywhere but William's face. He recognized the look. It was the look of someone who expected to be taken away again at any moment. "Emily," he said quietly, "you're safe here." She shook her head, her lips pressed tight. "They'll find me," she whispered. William felt something twist in him. He had fought rival CEOs, survived market crashes, stared down governments, but he had never felt so helpless as in this moment, faced with a child who had no place left in the world. Martha crouched to Emily's height, her voice soft, steady. "Sweetheart, no one's getting in here. Believe me, this place is built like a fortress." She guided the girl toward a bathroom, promising warm water and cocoa. Emily hesitated but let herself be led away, her small steps echoing across marble. When William was alone, he loosened his tie and walked to the window. The city stretched below him, alive with light and rain-slick streets, but he felt no connection to it. For years he had lived above everything, untouchable, unreachable, and yet tonight, he had opened his door to something raw, unpredictable, and human. He pressed his hand against the glass. The reflection staring back at him looked tired, blood drying at his temple, suit still immaculate but spirit undone. He barely recognized the man. A faint sound drew his attention. Emily had returned, wrapped in a towel, her hair damp but clean. She clutched the box as if it were part of her body. Martha followed, carrying a steaming mug of cocoa, the scent filling the cold air with something almost homelike. Emily sat carefully on the edge of the enormous couch, dwarfed by it, and took the mug in both hands. She blew on it but did not sip. Her eyes, luminous in the dim light, were fixed on William. "Where's your mom?" he asked gently, though he already knew the outline of the answer. "They took her," Emily said again, her voice breaking. She set the mug down and opened the box. She pulled out the photograph, laying it on her knees. Her fingers traced the smiling woman's face. "She told me to run when they came. She told me not to stop." William lowered himself into the armchair opposite, his chest tightening. He wanted to ask questions, names, places, details, but he stopped himself. What mattered now was not information. What mattered was the fragile thread of trust stretched between them. "Do you have anyone else?" he asked after a long pause. Emily shook her head. "It was just me and Mom." She hesitated, then added in a whisper, "And now it's just me." The words landed like stones in the cavern of his chest. Just me. He had said that in his own way for years after Margaret's death. He had hidden behind it, built empires around it, but hearing it from the lips of a 6-year-old tore something open. Martha placed a hand on Emily's shoulder. "Not anymore, dear," she said softly. "Not anymore." Later, when Martha led Emily to a guest room, one that had never been slept in, William lingered in the doorway. The room was vast, its bed covered in silk sheets, its walls hung with modern art, its closet empty. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, small and uncertain, the box still in her lap. Martha tucked a blanket around her, humming something low. "Good night, Emily," William said. The girl looked up, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to decide whether he meant the words. Then she nodded, whispered, "Good night," and lay down. Her lashes fluttered shut, her fingers still curled around the box. William stood there longer than he intended, watching the slow rhythm of her breathing until Martha gently closed the door. Back in the living room, the city lights spilled in through the glass walls. William poured himself a whiskey, held it, then set it aside untouched. He did not want numbness tonight. He wanted the rawness, the discomfort, the ache. For the first time in years, he wanted to feel everything. He sat in silence, the image of Emily curled on that enormous bed burning in his mind. She had no home, no father, a mother stolen by men who vanished into the city's underbelly. And now, by some twist of fate, she had landed here, in the fortress of a man who had forgotten how to live. He leaned back, eyes on the ceiling. For years, he had been a ghost haunting his own wealth. Tonight, a child had walked into his silence carrying nothing but a wooden box and a broken heart. And somehow, without knowing it, she had begun to call him back to life. The penthouse had never known the sound of a child's footsteps until that night. Its marble floors had been walked by brokers and lawyers. Its halls had echoed only with the sharp clicks of polished shoes. But now came the soft, hesitant tap of bare feet, damp from a warm bath, carrying a 6-year-old girl who clutched a blanket around her shoulders. Emily followed Martha into the living room, her small figure dwarfed by the cavernous space. The penthouse stretched like a cathedral, glass walls rising toward the ceiling, chandeliers scattering cold light, leather couches arranged like furniture in a showroom. But despite its grandeur, the place felt barren, as if every corner carried the echo of absence. She paused in the center of the room, her blue eyes wide. To a child who had known only small apartments and motels, this must have looked unreal. But her gaze did not hold awe. It held suspicion, the wariness of someone who had learned that beautiful places could be cages too. She held her wooden box close, as if it were a compass in this unfamiliar territory. William stood near the bar, still in his suit, though his tie had been loosened, a glass of water in his hand. He studied her quietly, struck by how much of his wealth seemed meaningless in her presence. $1 million view of the Bay Bridge glittered behind him, but Emily's eyes never wandered there. She kept them fixed on the carpet beneath her feet, as if afraid she might be asked to leave footprints she could never erase. Martha guided her to the couch and tucked the blanket around her shoulders. Emily sank into the cushions, disappearing into their size, her little hands clutching the edge of the blanket as though it might tether her to safety. Martha offered her a plate with a sandwich and fruit. The girl picked at the bread cautiously, chewing slowly, her gaze flicking now and then toward William, measuring him. The silence stretched. William cleared his throat. "Are you warmer now?" Emily nodded, but said nothing. Her eyes dropped to the box on her lap, and her fingers traced the brass clasp over and over, as if repeating a ritual. Martha broke the stillness with her calm voice. "She's exhausted, sir. Best to let her rest soon." But William couldn't take his eyes off the child. He had spent years surrounded by emptiness disguised as luxury. Yet tonight, the emptiness felt sharper, exposed by the presence of someone who saw it for what it was. This penthouse was not a home. It was a vault. Emily shifted suddenly, pulling the box close. Her voice was soft, barely audible. "Why do you live so high up?" The question startled him. He hesitated before answering. "Because I wanted to be above the noise." She frowned, thinking it over, then whispered, "It's lonely up here." The words struck harder than any accusation. He had no defense. He turned toward the window, the city glittering below like spilled jewels, and for the first time in years, he felt the altitude not as power, but as distance. Later, when Martha led Emily to the guest room, William lingered behind. The room had been designed by professionals. Silk sheets, abstract art, furniture chosen to impress. Yet as Emily climbed onto the bed, her small frame lost in the vastness, the truth was obvious. Beauty without warmth is another form of emptiness. She curled around her box, whispering something to herself, perhaps to her mother's photograph within. Martha dimmed the lights. William remained in the doorway, unable to move, watching Emily's lashes lower. For a fleeting moment, she seemed to surrender to sleep. But then she stirred, eyes half opening, her voice breaking the quiet. "Promise you won't let them take me back." The words were so fragile they almost dissolved in the air. William stepped closer, his hand tightening at his side. He wanted to promise, wanted to say, "I'll protect you." But the weight of such words terrified him. Instead, he nodded once, gravely, as though sealing a contract with the universe. Emily closed her eyes again, trusting that single gesture more than any speech. When the door clicked shut, William walked to the rooftop garden. Rain still clung to the lavender plants Martha tended, their scent rising faintly in the cool air. He stood beneath the open sky, letting the wind cut through the remnants of his composure. Below, the city pulsed, indifferent and eternal. Above, clouds moved like restless spirits. He pressed his hand against the railing and realized that for the first time in years, he was afraid. Not of loss, not of failure, but of failing a child who had already lost too much. Inside, the penthouse seemed to breathe differently. The silence was no longer neutral. It was expectant. Every painting, every piece of furniture, every gleaming surface seemed to ask what kind of man lived here and whether he deserved the fragile trust sleeping in his guest room. William sank into a chair, staring at the untouched whiskey on the table. He reached for it, then stopped. He did not want numbness. He wanted clarity. The girl's words echoed. "It's lonely up here." She had seen through the walls he had built, the fortress of wealth and glass, and spoken the truth he had long denied. He leaned back, closing his eyes. Somewhere in the silence he thought he heard Margaret's voice, tender and amused. "Find a fight that mends, not one that breaks." He had broken too many things in his pursuit of power. Perhaps this was the fight that could mend. Sleep did not come easily. But when it did, it came with an image of a small child curled around a wooden box, breathing steadily in the room down the hall. And for the first time in years, the empty penthouse was no longer entirely empty. Morning came reluctantly. A gray haze clung to the city, heavy with the residue of last night's storm. The penthouse windows, streaked with pale light, reflected a world that felt altered, as though something had shifted beneath its surface while the city slept. William Carter rose from a chair in which he had never meant to sleep. His suit jacket lay crumpled across the armrest, his shirt collar open, his hair unkempt. He rubbed the ache in his temple where the wound from last night throbbed faintly. For a moment he listened, truly listened, and caught it. The sound of a small breath, steady and fragile, coming from down the hall. Emily was still asleep. It was strange how quickly the child's presence had changed everything. Only hours ago, this penthouse had been a mausoleum of silence. Now, even in her sleep, Emily's existence filled the air like a fragile melody threading through the walls. The door buzzer sounded. William's body tensed. He crossed the marble floor, pressed the intercom, and heard the gravelly voice of Jack Donovan. William opened the door. Jack entered with the cautious gait of a man who had seen too much. He wore a weathered coat, his dark hair flecked with gray, and eyes that scanned every corner as if danger lurked even in luxury. The smell of rain and cigarettes clung to him. "You look like hell," Jack said, dropping into a leather chair. "What happened to your face?" "Ran into someone who didn't like me interfering," William replied dryly. "Sit down. We need to talk." Jack studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You don't call me at 1 in the morning unless it's bad. So tell me, Will, what's in your house that wasn't here yesterday?" Before William could answer, the sound of small footsteps echoed from the hall. Emily appeared barefoot, hair tangled from sleep, her box held tightly in her arms. Her eyes flicked to Jack, suspicious, before she climbed onto the couch without a word. She leaned into the cushions, clutching the box as if daring anyone to touch it. Jack raised his brows. "This her?" William nodded. Emily looked from one man to the other, her voice barely audible. "Are you a policeman?" Jack shook his head. "Not anymore, kid. I just find things." Something about the honesty in his tone seemed to ease her. She relaxed slightly, though her hands never left the box. William recounted everything: the rain, the men, the chase, Emily's whisper. They took her. He spoke with a precision he usually reserved for boardroom negotiations, but underneath his voice carried a rawness Jack had never heard. Jack listened, his expression unreadable. When William finished, silence stretched between them. Finally, Jack leaned forward. "I know a crew in Oakland. They move people, women, kids, not amateurs. They run through warehouses near the rail lines. Rumor is their boss is a guy named Victor Rain, wolf tattoo on his hand." At that, Emily sat up. Her eyes widened, fear flashing. She whispered, "That's him." The room seemed to contract around those words. William's jaw clenched. He remembered the glint of the tattoo, the chain rattling in the rain. Rage surged, hot and sharp, but he swallowed it. Action would matter more than fury. Jack lit a cigarette, ignoring William's frown at the smoke curling through the pristine air. If Rain's involved, this is bigger than one missing woman. He runs auctions, Will. Women vanish into that pipeline and don't come back. If the girl's mother is still alive... He didn't finish the sentence. Emily's voice broke the silence. "She is alive." Her small hands tightened on the box. "I know it." The conviction in her tone startled them both. It was not childish hope. It was certainty, as if she had anchored her soul to that belief. William leaned forward. "Then we'll find her." His voice was steel. Jack studied him carefully. "You're not the man who used to let things slide, are you? What's this really about, Will?" William looked at Emily. The girl was staring at the photo in her lap, her lips trembling but her chin held high. "It's about not walking away this time," he said. Jack exhaled smoke, his eyes narrowing. "All right. I'll start digging. But if you step into this, you step all the way in. These men don't care who you are. They won't bow to your money." "I'm not paying them," William said coldly. "I'm ending them." Emily looked up at him, eyes wide, and for the first time William realized the weight of his words in the presence of a child. He softened, leaned toward her, and said more gently, "We'll bring her back, Emily. That's a promise. Her lips trembled into something that wasn't quite a smile but wasn't despair either. She nodded once, clutching the box to her chest. The rest of the morning passed in fragments. Martha made breakfast, pancakes that Emily picked at but eventually ate. Jack spread photographs and notes across the marble counter, blurry surveillance images of warehouses, names scrawled in his terse handwriting, maps marked with red circles. Emily sat nearby, silent but attentive, her small fingers tracing the pendant in her box as if it were her anchor. When William stood at the window looking down at the city, he felt the pulse of something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. For so long, he had been a man who counted victories in numbers and losses in silence. Now the equation was different. He wasn't calculating profit. He was wagering his life against the shadows that had stolen a mother. That night, when Emily drifted to sleep on the couch, the box resting against her side, William and Jack sat across from each other in the dim light. The lavender plants on the rooftop swayed in the evening breeze. The city outside glittered, oblivious. Jack stubbed out his cigarette. "You're in deep now, Will. No way back." William looked at the child sleeping beneath the blanket, her face softened in dreams. "I don't want a way back." The shadows were moving, and for the first time in years, William was ready to move toward them. The city had shaken off the storm, but its streets still glistened with a wet sheen, like memories that refused to dry. From 47 floors above, San Francisco looked immaculate, its skyline sharp against the pale morning sky. Yet inside the penthouse, the air felt different, less sterile, as if the very presence of a child had disturbed the perfect emptiness that once reigned there. Emily sat cross-legged in the rooftop garden, her small body swallowed by one of Martha's oversized sweaters. In front of her, a square patch of soil, neatly arranged in concrete planters, carried the faint scent of damp earth and lavender. She dug her fingers gently into the dirt, her wooden box beside her, open to reveal the photograph of her mother propped against a planter like a shrine. William stood a few paces away, arms crossed, watching. He could not remember the last time anyone had sat in that garden. For years it had been Martha's domain, a small oasis she tended more for herself than for him. He had considered it decoration, something to soften the hard lines of his fortress. But now it was transformed into something else, a place where a 6-year-old sought refuge. Emily looked up at him suddenly, her hands muddy. "Can I plant it here?" she asked. William blinked. "Plant what?" She reached into her pocket and pulled out a tiny stem of lavender Martha had given her, its roots fragile but alive. "If I plant it, it will grow strong," she said matter-of-factly, as if the act of placing it in the soil guaranteed its survival. He swallowed, caught by the simplicity of her faith. He nodded. "Yes, plant it." She smiled faintly, bent low, and pressed the stem into the earth with both hands. William watched her small fingers cover it carefully, patting the soil into place with a seriousness that looked too heavy for her age. When she was finished, she sat back on her heels and whispered something under her breath. He couldn't hear the words, but he knew it was not play. It was prayer. The sight pierced him. For years he had believed his heart calcified, turned to stone after Margaret's death. But watching this little girl, who had lost more than a child should ever lose, kneel in the soil and whisper to a flower, he felt something stir inside the ruins of himself. That night, after dinner, Emily climbed onto the couch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She began to hum, a tune so soft he almost mistook it for the wind whistling through the glass. But it grew clearer, rising into the silence, a lullaby, halting and trembling, but undeniably music. William froze in his chair. He had not heard singing in his home for years. Margaret used to hum, absent-mindedly, while stirring soup or folding laundry. filling the air with the small warmth of domestic life. He had forgotten how much he missed that sound. Emily's voice cracked halfway through, and she stopped abruptly, embarrassed. She clutched the blanket tighter. "Sorry," she whispered. "Don't be," William said, his voice low, reverent. "It was beautiful." She looked at him for a long moment, as if testing the truth of his words. Then she tucked her face into the blanket, her shoulders shaking slightly, though whether from tears or relief, he could not tell. Later, when Martha guided her to bed, William lingered in the rooftop garden again. The lavender stem she had planted stood small and lonely in the soil, fragile against the night. He crouched beside it, touched the dirt with his hand, and for reasons he could not explain, whispered the same promise he had whispered to Emily. "You'll grow strong." The words startled him. He had not spoken with hope in so long that it felt foreign on his tongue. Inside, he found Emily asleep with her wooden box beside her. The photograph of her mother lay on the nightstand, the silver raindrop pendant draped across it. He stood in the doorway, watching her chest rise and fall. She had curled into the blanket like a child finally surrendering to safety. The sight of her broke something in him. For the first time in years, his eyes stung, and though no tears fell, the pressure behind them told him he was still capable of grief, and therefore of love. The next morning, Emily padded barefoot into the kitchen, hair tangled from sleep. She climbed onto a stool and asked Martha if she could help stir the pancake batter. Martha glanced at William, who nodded. He watched as the girl clutched the spoon awkwardly, spilling flour across the counter, giggling when Martha corrected her. The sound filled the room like sunlight. William found himself smiling without realizing it. When Emily caught his expression, she tilted her head. "You look different," she said. "How so?" "Not so lonely," she answered simply, returning her attention to the batter. William turned away quickly, his throat tight. A child had seen through him in a week what no adult had in years. That evening, as the city lit up below, William sat beside Emily in the rooftop garden. The lavender stem looked no different, but Emily crouched beside it, whispering encouragements as if the plant could hear. William asked softly, "Why lavender?" She shrugged. "Because it smells like home." The words lodged in his chest. For her, home had been stolen. And yet, in this garden, with this tiny plant, she was trying to build it again. William reached out, rested his hand on the soil beside hers, and for the first time allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this place could be something more than a fortress. As the night deepened, Emily leaned against him, her small shoulder pressing into his side. She was asleep within minutes, her breath steady, her trust complete. William sat motionless, afraid to disturb her, but inside, his heart swelled with a sensation he had thought forever lost. The penthouse was no longer silent. It was alive. And William Carter, the man who had once declared himself finished with love, felt his heart begin to open. The night smelled of rust and diesel. Across the water, the warehouses of Richmond rose like black teeth against the horizon, their corrugated walls groaning in the wind. Floodlights buzzed sporadically, casting cones of yellow over cracked pavement, while the rattle of freight trains echoed through the distance. It was a place where the city forgot to look, where men like Victor Rain thrived. William crouched behind a row of shipping containers, his breath shallow, his heart hammering harder than it had in decades. Beside him, Jack Donovan adjusted the lens of a compact drone controller, his weathered hands steady despite the tension. A few yards away, Nathan Briggs, the ex-FBI agent Jack had called in, scanned the compound with night vision binoculars. Briggs was tall, lean, his face etched with lines of battles past. He carried himself with the cold efficiency of someone who had spent too long in shadows. "Warehouse C," Briggs muttered. That's where they keep them. Too much security around that door for it to be empty. The drone swooped silently above, its camera relaying grainy images to Jack's tablet. The screen flickered, showing women huddled in a corner, wrists bound, their faces pale with exhaustion. William leaned closer, his jaw tightening. The image was blurred, but he thought he recognized dark hair, the tilt of a familiar jawline. "Zoom," he ordered. Jack complied, the drone edging nearer to the grimy window. The camera sharpened on one figure slumped against the wall. Her head lolled forward, but when she shifted slightly, William saw it, the curve of her cheek, the shape of her mouth. He had never seen her before, but in that instant, he knew. "It's her," William whispered. "Emily's mother." Briggs exhaled slowly. "Alive. Barely. We don't have much time." William's pulse roared in his ears. He pictured Emily asleep in the penthouse, curled around her box, trusting him with a faith he did not deserve. He thought of her words. They took her. She's alive. And felt the weight of them solidify into a vow. Then, on the drone's feed, a movement. A man entered the frame. Heavy-set, shaved head, the wolf tattoo glinting under fluorescent light. Victor Rain. He barked orders, his voice muffled but brutal, and one of his men struck a woman too slow to rise. William's body went rigid, his nails dug into his palms. Rage threatened to overtake reason. "Easy," Briggs warned. "We moved too soon, we're all dead. And so are they." As if on cue, one of the guards outside looked up, eyes narrowing. The drone had cast a faint shadow against the corrugated wall. Alarms erupted, sharp whistles, shouting voices. Floodlights flared to life, cutting through the darkness. "Damn it," Jack hissed. "They saw it." The compound exploded with noise. Men spilled from doorways, rifles slung over their shoulders. Engines roared as black SUVs rolled into position, blocking the gates. "Move!" Briggs barked. He grabbed William's arm, dragging him back behind the containers as a spray of bullets chewed through the metal. Sparks flew, ricochets whining past their ears. William hit the ground hard, breath knocked from his lungs, but adrenaline dragged him up again. "This was recon," Jack growled, shoving the controller into his pack. "Not a rescue. We're not equipped for this." William's eyes burned with fury. "We can't leave them." "We leave now," Briggs snapped, "or no one leaves at all." Gunfire shredded the night. A spotlight swept across the yard, catching Briggs's shoulder. He fired back once, a single sharp report, and the beam shattered into darkness. Jack threw a smoke grenade, its hiss filling the air as a gray curtain blossomed between them and the advancing men. They ran. Feet pounded over gravel, lungs burning, the warehouse fading behind them in a haze of gunfire and smoke. William stumbled once, knees slamming against concrete, but Jack hauled him upright with a curse. They reached the edge of the dock, dove behind a stack of barrels, and crouched there gasping as the compound swarmed with shouts and flashing lights. "Close," Briggs muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "Too close." William pressed a hand to his temple, chest heaving. His suit was torn, his hands scraped raw, but none of that mattered. The only image in his mind was the drone's final feed. Trina Hayes slumped against a wall, alive, waiting. "We have proof now," Jack said, holding up the tablet. "Enough to bring the FBI in officially. With this footage, they can't ignore it." William stared out at the dark water, fury and resolve churning inside him. He had spent his life wielding power in boardrooms, bending markets to his will. But this was different. This was not about profit or leverage. This was about a little girl planting lavender in his garden, whispering that it would grow strong, believing her mother would come home. He clenched his fists, his voice low but unyielding. Then we bring the whole damn weight of the law down on them. No more shadows. Briggs nodded grimly. We'll set it in motion. But understand this. Victor Rain won't run. He'll come for you. For the girl. William's jaw tightened. Then let him. He'll find I'm not the man I was. Behind them, the city lights shimmered on the bay, reflecting a world that had looked the other way for too long. Ahead, the warehouse compound loomed like a fortress, its secrets bared at last. And in the middle of it all, William Carter, once a king without a kingdom, felt himself step fully into a war that would either destroy him or finally give his life meaning. The first pale line of dawn stretched across the horizon, painting the bay in strokes of silver and rose. Richmond's warehouses, hulking shadows against the light, stood silent but tense, like predators waiting to pounce. Behind their corrugated walls, lives hung in the balance. William Carter stood among the armored vehicles at the FBI staging ground, the damp air heavy with the scent of salt and rust. He wore a black jacket borrowed from Briggs, his hair uncombed, his temples still bandaged from the wound of that rain-soaked night. Around him, agents checked weapons, clipped radios, muttered terse commands. The thrum of helicopters above blended with the low growl of engines waiting to roar. Jack Donovan leaned against a steel barrier, cigarette unlit between his lips. His eyes were bloodshot but sharp. "You're not supposed to be here," he muttered. William didn't answer. He wasn't leaving. Not while Emily's mother still sat in that warehouse, chained and fading. Not after Emily had looked at him with eyes full of certainty and whispered, "She's alive." Briggs approached, his stance rigid. "We have the footage. The Bureau is convinced. We go in clean, quick, coordinated." He looked at William, expression hard. "You stay behind this line. Understood?" William met his gaze without blinking. "I understand. But when they bring her out, I'll be the first one she sees." Briggs didn't argue. He had seen men like William before, broken men who had rediscovered a reason to fight. Sometimes they were more dangerous than soldiers. The sky brightened to pale gold. A final signal passed through the radios. The command came like thunder. "Go!" Engines roared. The steel gate of the compound exploded inward as an armored vehicle rammed it aside. Shouts erupted. Gunfire cracked. The helicopters descended low, their floodlights cutting through smoke and chaos. FBI agents poured in, black figures against the fire of dawn, shouting commands drowned by the storm of noise, and William stood at the perimeter, fists clenched, heart hammering with every shot fired. Through binoculars, he glimpsed flashes of movement. Women herded from the back rooms, hands shielding their faces, guards dragged down under the weight of armed men. He searched frantically for one face, one figure, and then he saw her. Trina Hayes stumbled from the warehouse, her dark hair tangled, her clothes torn, her face pale but unmistakably alive. She clung to the arm of an agent guiding her, her legs buckling under each step. For a moment, William forgot to breathe. Against all odds, Emily's faith had been right. He pushed forward before anyone could stop him. He met them halfway, his voice rough. "Trina Hayes?" She blinked at him, disoriented, fear etched deep. Who are you?" "I'm a friend," William said quickly. "Your daughter is safe. Emily is safe." At the name, Trina's eyes widened. Her strength nearly gave out, but she clutched his sleeve with desperate fingers. "Emily?" William steadied her. "She's waiting for you." They half-carried her through the smoke, past the chaos of men still being dragged from corners, past the ruined gates and shattered glass. The rising sun lit the bay in hues of fire, and amid that fire, William felt the weight of a miracle. Hours later, when the compound had been secured and the last of the captives processed, William brought Trina to the penthouse. The elevator doors opened, and there, Standing barefoot in Martha's sweater, clutching her box, was Emily. The moment the child saw her mother, the box fell from her hands. She screamed one word, "Mommy!" and sprinted across the marble floor, her small feet slapping against stone. Trina dropped to her knees, arms outstretched, tears blinding her. They collided with a force that shook the silence of the penthouse like an earthquake. Emily buried her face in her mother's chest, sobbing with relief. Trina held her so tightly it seemed she would never let go again, whispering her name over and over, as if to prove to herself this reunion was not a dream. William stood at a distance, his throat tight, his vision blurred. Martha pressed a hand to her mouth, tears running freely down her cheeks. Even Jack turned away, pretending to focus on the window, his cigarette trembling between his fingers. In the middle of the penthouse, beneath the golden light of dawn, a family had been stitched back together. Emily lifted her face, tear-streaked but radiant. "I told you," she said breathlessly to William. "I told you she was alive." William smiled, a real, unguarded smile that felt foreign and yet inevitable. "You were right, Emily. You were right." For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his wealth, his grief, his loneliness fall away. In their place was something far stronger: purpose, connection, a fragile hope that had survived storms and shadows and was now blooming in the light of morning. As the lavender plant swayed in the rooftop garden, kissed by sunlight, William Carter realized he had not only saved a mother, he had been saved by a child who ran through the rain. The lavender in the rooftop garden had begun to lift its head toward the sky, stubborn against the wind, fragile yet alive. William Carter stood there in the cool evening, the city glittering below, but his eyes kept drifting toward the door. Inside, Emily was drawing at the kitchen table with Martha, Trina resting on the couch nearby. The penthouse, once a mausoleum, now breathed with voices, footsteps, laughter. Yet William could not shake the unease gnawing at his chest. Victor Rain had escaped. The FBI had assured him they would track the trafficker down, that a man with a wolf tattoo could not vanish forever. But William had lived long enough to know that shadows had patience. They did not retreat. They waited. And when they returned, they struck where it hurt most. That night, the waiting ended. It began with a silence too deep for the city. The hum of traffic below seemed to vanish, as though the world itself held its breath. William, restless, stepped back inside and froze. The living room lights flickered once, twice. Then the security panel near the door went dark. Martha's voice called from the kitchen. "Sir! The power—" Her words cut short with a gasp. The elevator dinged, a sound far too soft to carry menace. Yet it did. William's blood ran cold. He strode toward the hall just as the doors slid open. Victor Rain stepped out. The wolf tattoo gleamed on his hand, a sneer twisting his scarred face. Behind him, two men moved with predator's ease. Guns glinted in the dim light. Trina let out a strangled cry and pulled Emily into her arms, shoving her toward the closet. "Run, baby!" Emily stumbled, the wooden box clutched in her hands, tears already streaming down her cheeks. Trina dragged her inside the closet, slammed the door, and pressed her back against it, shielding her child with her own body. William moved before he thought. He planted himself in the center of the room, between the intruders and the closet, his fists clenched, his breath sharp. His heart hammered not with fear, but with certainty. This was the fight fate had been leading him toward. Ron's voice slithered through the room. "Carter, you think you can steal from me? You think you can take what's mine?" "She was never yours," William said, his voice steady, low. "You will not take her." The gun in Ron's hand lifted, its black mouth yawning at William's chest. For a heartbeat, silence held. William thought of Margaret, of empty nights, of Emily's eyes when she whispered, "Don't let them send me back." He thought of lavender stems and lullabies, of a 6-year-old who had taught him to feel again, and in that instant, fear abandoned him. He stepped forward. Gunfire shattered the air. Glass splintered. Martha screamed. William staggered, blood blooming across his shoulder, but he did not fall. He roared, driving himself into the nearest man, knocking the weapon aside, his fists fueled by years of grief and rage. They crashed into the table, splintering wood, plates scattering like shrapnel. Ron shouted, charging forward, but then the front door burst open. A shot rang out. Victor staggered, eyes wide, as Special Agent Monroe surged into the room, weapon raised. More agents followed, their voices commanding, their presence overwhelming. Rain fired wildly, glass raining down from shattered windows. William dove to shield the closet as bullets ripped into the walls. Emily screamed inside, her small fists pounding against the door. And then it ended as suddenly as it began. One clean shot from Monroe struck true. Victor Rain fell, the wolf tattoo on his hand catching the last glint of city light before he collapsed onto the marble floor. Lifeless. His men dropped their weapons, dragged down by agents, shackled with iron. The room rang with silence once more, but it was a silence different from before. Heavy, echoing, final. William leaned against the closet door, blood soaking his sleeve, his breath ragged. He opened it slowly. Emily leapt into his arms, sobbing, her box clattering to the floor. Trina followed, her face streaked with tears, gathering both daughter and savior in a desperate embrace. "You will not take her," William repeated, voice hoarse, as if sealing the vow into stone. Emily clung to him, whispering over and over through her tears, "You kept me safe. You kept me safe." The agents moved through the penthouse, securing the scene, but William saw none of it. His world had narrowed to the fragile weight of a child in his arms, and the knowledge that for once he had not failed. In the shattered glass, in the blood and smoke, something larger had been born. The shadows had struck, but they had not won. And in William's heart, for the first time in years, there was light. A month passed, and the city wore spring like a new coat. The storms had gone, leaving skies rinsed clean and mornings that shimmered with light. San Francisco was still its restless self, horns blaring, ferries cutting through the bay, skyscrapers glittering with ambition. But in one glass tower, something had changed so completely it was almost unrecognizable. The penthouse was no longer silent. It was filled now with voices. Emily's laughter carried down the hall, her footsteps a rapid percussion across the marble. Trina's softer tones followed, sometimes coaxing, sometimes scolding gently, always warm. Even Martha seemed transformed. Her brisk efficiency softened into something grandmotherly. For William, every sound felt like a benediction. He stood in the kitchen doorway one morning, watching as Emily sat at the table, her hair pulled back in 2 uneven pigtails. She was bent over a bowl of cereal, speaking animatedly to Trina, who listened with the patient smile of someone who knew the value of every small story her child told. The wooden box sat beside Emily, as always, but it was no longer clutched with desperate fingers. It rested, open, its treasures spread like family heirlooms instead of lifelines. When Emily caught sight of William, she waved enthusiastically. "Good morning." The words struck him harder than any deal ever had. Simple, unguarded, offered without fear. He cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how much it meant to be greeted like that. "Good morning, Emily." Later that afternoon, the penthouse filled again, but this time with strangers, reporters, officials, survivors. Trina had agreed, reluctantly, to speak about what had happened. She stood behind a small podium in the vast living room, cameras humming, her hands trembling only at first. She told her story, not just her own, but those of the women she had seen locked in that warehouse, nameless and forgotten. She spoke not as a victim, but as a witness, her voice clear, resolute. And then she announced the creation of the Second Light Foundation, a place where women and children could rebuild after darkness. The name had been Emily's suggestion. "Because the first light goes out sometimes," the girl had explained solemnly. "But you can always find a second one." Applause filled the room, echoing against the glass walls. William stood at the back, unseen, his chest tight. For years his wealth had built towers that reached the sky. But this was the first time he saw something he had given rise to light up lives instead of balance sheets. That evening, when the reporters had gone and the penthouse was quiet again, William stepped onto the rooftop garden. Emily was there, kneeling beside the lavender she had planted. The tiny stem had grown taller, sturdier, its leaves reaching for the sky. She watered it carefully, humming under her breath. He crouched beside her. "It looks stronger." She nodded. "I told you it would grow." For a moment they watched in silence. The city below glittered, but the real light was here, in the small green thing pushing its way into the world. Emily turned, her eyes luminous in the fading sun. "Are we normal now?" The question pierced him. He had lived too long in a world where normal meant hollow victories, silent dinners, rooms that echoed with loneliness. He looked at her. At Trina watching from the doorway, at the lavender that refused to die, and he felt something greater than normal. "No, Emily," he said softly, his voice breaking into a smile. "We are something better. We are family." She grinned, and without hesitation leaned into his side. He wrapped an arm around her, steady and sure. For the first time since Margaret's death, he felt the weight of love not as a memory, but as a presence. Later, when the city lights flickered on, William sat at his desk. In front of him lay a blank page. For years, he had written nothing but signatures, contracts, the cold ink of commerce. Tonight he wrote an essay. Its title, "The Night a Child Ran Through the Rain and Saved Me." The words flowed easily. He wrote about despair and second chances, about violence and courage, about how one child's faith could pierce the armor of a man who thought himself beyond redemption. He wrote not to impress, but to testify. When he finished, he placed the pen down and closed his eyes. Outside the window, the lavender swayed in the wind, fragile yet enduring, like the people who now filled his life. The penthouse, once empty, sterile, silent, had become a house with light. And in that light, William Carter finally found his way home. Thank you for walking through this story with me. If it touched your heart, please share it, leave a comment, and subscribe. Every story we tell reminds us, even in the darkest nights, there is always a second light.